Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name is Camille and today we are continuing on with this series of subgenres in fantasy. Specifically, I want to talk about horror and dread. Now, caveat, I'm not a big horror reader, and that is because horror is meant to invoke this physiological response in your body. Like, it's supposed to make your heart pound, it's supposed to make your hands sweat, it's supposed to trigger that fight or flight response in the reader. That is a big part of horror. And I have like crippling anxiety to the point where when I'm reading a true horror story, it gives me like heart palpitations. So I'm not a big horror reader. With that said, however, I have read a lot of Stephen King, courtesy of one of my grandmothers. Thank you. And I've watched quite a few horror movies. And I'm not going to talk about horror as like a whole genre. I'm going to talk about like how to use these elements in fantasy. So it's going to be a very generalized, surface sort of discussion that we're going to have. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of the villain, or more accurately, the monster in a horror story. The thing about having an evil entity, and a big thing with horror, is that, you know, it's this supernatural force that we cannot combat. Like, we can't win against this all-powerful, all-knowing supernatural being because we're just mortals. And you see this in fantasy in Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Voldemort, for the first 3 books, is like this unknown. It is very much the fear of the unknown, but more than that, you know, the most powerful wizard. And then we have Sauron, who was the most powerful guy, all-seeing, all-knowing, supernatural in comparison to these other characters. You know, yes, they can use magic, or in the area of Lord of the Rings, you know, some of these characters are very war knowledgeable, like they're very good at the weapons, yada, yada, yada. The elves have their own type of like magic, but these other characters are a lot stronger or more knowing, etc., etc. So there's always a supernatural element. Now, fear of the unknown is very important in horror. The thing about this is I watched this horror movie like years and years ago, and it was like The Little Creatures, or some stupid title, but it was like these kids are being taken and killed and whatever, and we find out at like the midpoint of the movie that it was like these little gremlin creatures that like live under the floors that just want to steal like children's teeth, and it totally took away that element of the unknown. You know, once you knew that it was just these little stupid gremlin creatures, there's no more fear. So that's very important. That was such a horrible horror movie. Like, it wasn't scary at all. It was stupid. Like, I almost walked out, and just, it was so bad. So fear of the unknown is really important. And, let's see. So there's the fear of the unknown, and then there's like the all-powerful. So one of my favorite Stephen King books is Needful Things, and it's about this shop owner named Leland Gaunt, who is like a supernatural being. He has merchandise in his shop and sells things to the people of this small town that basically makes them go stir crazy. It makes them guilty or angry, and it basically plays on their already stirring emotions and makes them like want to kill each other or commit suicide or whatever. And we are aware of Leland Gaunt. We actually get scenes from his point of view as the monster. We get scenes from his point of view. But he's all-powerful, and you get to see the other characters' points of view, and you realize that they have no idea what or who this guy is and how he does these certain things. So the horror aspect of like the abject fear isn't necessarily there, but the terror and the dread for these other characters trying to combat this monster is certainly there. And that's one of my favorite Stephen King books, because it actually doesn't evoke that fight or flight response in me when I'm reading it, but it does make me worry for the characters. So I think that's just like a thing about Stephen King. Like, he does a very good job with character, but that's a total sidebar. So anyways, another thing with horror is setting, or something that you can invoke is setting. So like haunted house or the creepy woods, these things can essentially be the monsters in your story. In Stephen King's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, you have this young girl who gets lost in the woods, and she is in love with this baseball player, Tom Gordon, and she loves the baseball games, loves listening to the games on the radio, and she's lost in the woods, and there's like no monster. It's really just the woods that is the monster. And when it comes to setting in horror, language is basically your best tool. How do you describe the woods? It's, not going to be like a whispering willow and a summer blue sky. It's going to be dark and murky. You can almost make the setting like a physical entity where it's breathing back at you, or the branches are like clawing towards the character. And it really comes down to you as the author putting yourself in that situation, and what would that dark, eerie place feel like? Would it feel like a person reaching for you? That kind of thing. So next, mental. There is this type of horror story where, is it the character's own psyche? This is also tied into setting. There are certain places in horror stories where it makes characters go crazy, like in Rose Red, which was directed by Stephen King. I swear, that's like literally the only horror I know. Sorry, I suck. But Rose Red is one of my favorite horror movies, one of my favorite movies in general, but it's haunted house, based on the Winchester haunted house aesthetic, I guess. But a group of scientists and whatnot go into this house to study the supernatural activity, and they all just start going crazy. But that's a big theme in horror, is you have a character who is experiencing things that are supernatural, experiencing things that are trying to harm them or harm people close to them. And the character usually comes to this idea of, am I sane or not? And, it's almost a trope nowadays to do it was all in their head, it was all just a dream kind of thing. So if you're going, and I think it's easy to fall into that, it's easy to put your own mindset into the head of your character and say, well, if I was being haunted by this creepy unknown monster, I would totally think that I'm going insane. But there are people out there who have a very firm grip on reality who wouldn't question their mental state. So, that's always a step you could take your character. That's a characteristic you can give someone is, does this character have a strong mental state? Do they have a firm grasp of reality? Does mental illness run into their family? The type of mental illness where hallucinations, whether they're physical hallucinations or sensory, these are things you need to figure out about your character. I think that's very important when it comes to horror. It's rare that an author has been through anything like what they're putting their characters through. So it's very important to do your research and really flesh out your characters when you're writing this type of story. Now, another big thing with horror is it is meant to invoke this physiological response in the reader, like I talked about at the beginning of the video. Your reader their heart should be pounding. They should be like having this physical reaction to the story. And the only way you're going to know if your story does this is if you give it to beta readers. That's very important. If you're trying to get this fight or flight response in your reader triggered, you need to have beta readers to tell you if it's working, because you as the author know the story, so your opinion doesn't matter. In a nice way, of course. And another theme in horror too is this idea of who is the real monster. So let's talk about it. I think everyone has either seen Stephen King's movie, It. I mean, I think there's like 3 versions or 2 versions. I think there's 2 versions of the movie out now. And then, of course, there's the book. But one of my favorite things about that story, it's both one of my favorite things and like one of the most disgusting things, is that, the monster is not really the monster. The real monster is the main female protagonist's dad, who is like a creepy asshole rapist. But, in the movie It, the monster, the creature monster, is literally just following its nature. It does what it does. It's not going to change. It is. But then you have this human character who is literally just a stain on humanity and is a horrible person and should be castrated and probably locked up in a cell forever. So that's a common theme. Who is the real monster? And I think this is very common in fantasy, in this idea of you have like an evil, supernatural kind of overlord, yada, yada, yada. But then you have people who like love the overlord or who are okay with it, like the people in his circle. And then you have the rebellious sect of people. And usually the reader is supposed to be rooting for the rebels. It is the underdogs. We're supposed to root for this main character who was nothing and then gets swept into this political whatever. And they're the good guys. But you can always tell that kind of story from the other point of view, where maybe the Dark Overlord isn't actually a Dark Overlord, and it's the rebels who are the monsters. I should totally write that book. But it's this idea of subverting reader expectations. And, this video is supposed to be on horror, but that's not just horror. I think that's all genres, is being able to understand the tropes of the genre so that you can subvert them and essentially write a unique take on an old story. But yeah, if you have a monster book, it's good to almost mirror that monster with the fucked up side of humanity, because that's realistic. Just my opinion. And people. So this takes us into this idea of people. My favorite horror movie in the whole world, and my husband's favorite horror movie in the whole world, is The Strangers. I can't watch it that much because I freak out. But basically, if you haven't seen The Strangers, it's not a monster movie. It is real people doing horrible things with no motivation. It's literally just horrible people stalking and killing these people in their house just because they want to. And that is the darkest side of humanity. And when you go to that place in a horror story, there's nowhere to hide for the reader, because there are people in the world like that, as opposed to a monster book where, you can read a story about a supernatural monster and come out at the end and go, monsters aren't real. The clown from It isn't real. Leland Gaunt isn't real. There's no such thing as haunted houses, but like crazy sociopathic people are real. So if you're going for that sense of realism with like real dread and whatever, you can have these sort of people who are just sociopaths. However, I definitely have a feeling that that is an overused characteristic. Like I said, I'm not a big reader of the horror genre in general, but that just sounds like something that would play well in the genre. Like, there are just way too many stories about, yeah, this guy is just like a crazy killer, whatever. So it really comes down to, if you're going with that sense, making the other characters fleshed out and personal, giving them motivations, yada, yada, yada. So, I mean, when it comes to horror and fantasy, to me, any like fantasy that I've read that even has some kind of horror element, it's like dark fantasy or grim dark fantasy. And the thing with dark fantasy is it's very much an aesthetic. It's not necessarily a monster book, though there could be like an evil villain type of thing. And then with grimdark, it's more blood and gore, which is kind of like an aesthetic thing. Or it's political intrigue ending in like blood and gore and manipulation and all this kind of stuff. So since I'm not a huge reader of the horror genre, I can only touch on these things a little. But the point of these videos is to get you guys to think, to perhaps present an alternate viewpoint to these things, just so that you can see it from a different angle. You know, that's the whole thing with writing, is that you're not going to be good until you practice. I can't tell you exactly step by step how to write a story. It's really all about how you are coming at things and looking at them, and if you practice. So if I can give you an alternate point of view that helps in some way, then I'm essentially doing my job with these videos. But nothing makes up for you practicing and you actually writing the damn book. So yeah. You know, if I get to a point where I start reading more horror, I'll probably revisit this topic. Not likely, because I'm pretty sure my crippling anxiety is not going to go away, but we'll see. So next week, we're going to talk about romance. Talk about death and murder today, romance next week. So thank you for watching. I'll probably link some resources down below just because of my lack of knowledge on the topic. So check the thingy bopper. But for now, as always, you should be writing and researching stuff.